Welcome back to the France 24 debate. Tonight, we're asking what can Antonio Guterres do as the new UN Secretary-General? And in fact, what can the UN itself do? Is it still united or is it, well, pretty useless these days? Our panel with us tonight, here with me in the studio, I've got Yves Doutrieux, who was France's Deputy Permanent Representative to the UN from 1998 to 2002. Joining us by satellite from Washington, we've got Dov Zakheim, who was the former US Under-Secretary of Defense and a senior foreign policy advisor to George W. Bush. Also on the line, joining us from the UK, we've got Professor of Law and Global Development, Rosa Friedman from the University of Reading. And from Portugal, Antonio Guterres' home country, we've got Pedro Mota Soares, a member of Parliament for the Christian Democratic People's Party. Thank you all again very much for being with us. Time now to get, I guess, into some of the real meat and drink of this debate. Is the UN still effective in 2016? I'm going to open that up to you, Dov Zakheim. You touched on it in the first half of the debate. Do you think the UN can still play a role?
Absolutely. Not everywhere. You have to think back to the Cold War, where people like Dag Hammarskjöld had to navigate between the Soviet Union and the United States, and still the UN was able to do things. When I was Undersecretary, I was also coordinator for civilian operations of DoD in Afghanistan, and I worked with Jean Arnaud of the UN, and they did a tremendous job there. The UN can do good things. There's no question about it. And I think Guterres has some jobs that he could certainly carry out. He could stop the raping in Africa, for instance, in South Sudan or the Central African Republic, really clamp down on that. You've heard that he's a very forceful person. Hopefully he can deal with that. He could probably deal with some of the waste that still goes on in the UN, the administrative side. But when you talk about bridging the gap between Russia and China on the one hand and the West on the other, of course it's going to be tough. But it is doable. And if the man is able somehow to speak to all sides, and clearly he must have convinced all sides or else he wouldn't be the new Secretary General, then there's always hope. Every side has its own self-interest. He's got to be able to somehow coordinate the self-interest of the different nations so that you can, for example, bring some kind of cessation of the misery in Syria, with which he is fully familiar, having been the High Commissioner. So it really depends. I wouldn't write off the UN. On the other hand, I wouldn't overblow its influence. Too many people think the UN can solve everything, and that's almost as silly as saying the UN can solve nothing. It's somewhere in between. A good Secretary General moves it closer to solving more problems. A weak Secretary General, and we've seen some of those, moves it further away.
On Syria, though, concretely, the example that you raised, we've just seen vetoes posed every time the UN has tried to pass a resolution on Syria. I mean, what kind of deal could he possibly strike there?
Well, obviously, it can't just be a resolution by itself. There has to be an understanding between Russia and the United States, and to some extent Iran. I think that Mr. Assad's hands are actually much more tied than he would like because he depends so heavily on the Russians and the Iranians. Turkey has to be a player here. It's going to be a challenge. If it wasn't a challenge, then we wouldn't have had a 5-year civil war still going on and getting worse and worse. Can something be done? Possibly. Guterres is about as good as anybody who could run the UN and find some kind of solution. I'm not saying he can do it. I'm saying he has the potential to do it.
OK, I want to put these points now to you, Yves Doutrieux, France's former Deputy Permanent Representative to the UN. You know the workings of this place. Are you optimistic that there can be movement on Syria, some common ground here found by Antonio Guterres?
You know, one should not overestimate the role of the UN Secretary General. As the previous speaker said, it's not easier, but it's more doable in some region of Africa. But when you have big powers and regional powers fighting against each other, in Syria. It's much more complicated for the Secretary General to interfere. He had a special representative in charge of that. There was Mr. Brahimi, Kofi Annan at the beginning, now Sergio Mistura. So he can play a role. But first, we need much more consensus between key players, regional players, superpower. Otherwise, we will continue to have this bloodshed. So the role of the Secretary General is key, but it's not the single key, I would say. And too often, the media would say UN is doing nothing. There is no need of UN because UN cannot act, but it's because of a lack of consensus of big players. But the Secretary General could play a role in order to improve the consensus.
Rosa Friedman, there in Reading for us. Do you think that the UN needs reform? And if so, what reform in order to be an effective player in today's world?
Well, I'll answer that in a second. Just to go to what the two previous speakers have said. We seem to think, or many people seem to think, that the Secretary General runs the United Nations. The Secretary General is there to serve. The United Nations is made up of member states, not just of the superpowers, not just of the P5 or the big regional players. It's made up of 193 member states who all have property in this organisation and therefore responsibilities and duties. It's not enough to say the Secretary General needs to come in and work out the power dynamics, or that the 15 Security Council members are the only ones that matter, because the United Nations is a large organisation with very many aspects, and all of the member states can use their political power and their political pressure, whether it's through trade and economics or whether it's in other ways, to try and push for resolutions, whether it's in Sudan or whether it's in Syria. And I think that comes to the question that you're asking. Does the UN need reform? Absolutely. It needs to be stripped down. At the moment, it spends far too much money with far too much waste and far too much overlap between different bodies. And the Security Council, as well as other organs, but particularly the Security Council, is opaque. The veto powers are out of date, and the ways in which member states are elected to the Security Council simply doesn't work for an organisation with so many states. It might have worked when there were 50, but it certainly doesn't work with nearly 200.
Let me ask Pedro Muta Soares in Portugal. Antonio Guterres, you were praising him in the first half of the debate. Do you think he does have the qualities needed to really reform the UN, to get meaningful reform and take action, to make it less opaque, to bring in developing countries, to cut down waste?
Honestly,
do you think he can do that?
I do think he does. We need to reform the UN. That's something that I think we all can agree on. The UN is a very important structure, but it's still very much linked to the past. It's still very much linked to the world during the Cold War. And I don't believe that we can completely change it. I believe that we can change it with a policy of small steps. I think that's really what Antonio Guterres can bring to the UN. Of course, that we need dialogue, but we need the will as well from the member states, especially from the major political influences and major political countries to do that. And that's always very, very difficult. But I think this is firstly the time. Nowadays, I think especially young generations, when they look at the actual politicians, the actual leaders, they really want us to make some real changes. And what's happening nowadays in the world, a world that it's sometimes closing itself, very important blocks that are starting to close themselves, we need to go a little bit further regarding the role of the UN. And there's another aspect that I think is important. It's the first time in 25 years that we have an European going back into the UN. Of course, there was this big argument and discussion if we should have a European from the eastern side or not. And I think it's a little bit ridiculous because nowadays the European Union Europe is a whole, not very segmented. But of course we know that some of the major things that we have to do are also concerning and regarding the European Union. And I think that's why we have a major opportunity to try to really make strong, small, but very strong steps of change and reform. And I think that Antonio Guterres, Mr. Guterres, may really have the ability on doing it. He's someone that is always very concerned with equilibriums, with dialogue, and probably he can be the right man at the right time, in the right place to try to do that.
Well, one reform step, which certainly wouldn't be a small step, it wouldn't be going softly at all, has actually been evoked by a high-up member of the UN, the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, Zeid Ra'ad Al Hussein. Now, he has actually come out and said just in the last few days that the UN Security Council should, without any further delay, adopt criteria to restrain members from using the veto when there are serious concerns that war crimes, crimes against humanity or genocide may have been committed. So he is actually saying, let's get rid of the veto there, which has blocked action on Syria. I want to put that suggestion to my panel.
It's exactly the French proposal. 10 years ago, I think it was Hubert Védrine the first, who said that the P5 should commit, each of them, never use a veto in case of a massive crime of that kind. And if they have to cast a veto, they should first explain it and only use it because of their own national interests. But how come they could explain that it would be for their own vital national interests that they would veto a resolution which is fighting against international crime? So we have proposed that.
But it wasn't adopted,
no,
clearly.
I'm speaking about proposals, exactly like
this would be extremely difficult to be.
But we have to discuss it. It has been discussed. I know that there is a group of nearly more than 100 UN members who are in favor of such an evolution. By the way, it would be short of any UN charter change, because to change a UN charter, it's a very difficult process. It's like to change or to amend the US Constitution, as complicated. So we need to try to have common commitments without UN charter change.
I want to put this issue to the rest of our panel. Dov Zakheim in Washington, can you see this suggestion of restraining the use of the veto ever becoming a reality?
Well, I can't say never, because you just don't say never, but I certainly can't see it in anything like the foreseeable future. And the reason I say that is any country on the P5 can define national interest as it wishes. So, for example, if China decides that going after Sudan is not in its national interest, it's going to veto. If my country feels that beating up on Israel every other day is not in its national interest, it vetoes. If Russia believes that going after it on Crimea is not in its national interest, it vetoes. And so for Britain and so for France. Obviously, if you're not on the Security Council as a permanent member, you want to change the veto system. But the fact of the matter is that you've got 5 countries that have the veto, and the only change we've ever seen was when China replaced Taiwan, which calls itself the Republic of China, some years back. Other than that, we haven't seen any change, for the very simple reason that any proposal for a change is going to get vetoed. It's just not going to happen, at least not for the foreseeable future.
Okay, you want to come back in very quickly?
There is another issue which was referred to earlier. It's a number of the members of the Security Council. And it's weird today to see that a country like India, Japan, Germany, or Brazil, or some African countries are not permanent members. So together with the UK, we favor the extension of the number of permanent members, but till now, it has not been possible to reach a compromise.
Yeah, these are huge changes. Rosa Friedman, do you ever foresee the day that the veto could be reformed, or perhaps that the composition of the Permanent Security Council could be reformed? I mean, we've had Britain just voting itself out of Europe. Perhaps it should get off the Security Council and make way for India, for example.
Look, I think the time that reform will come will be the time that the rest of the United Nations, outside of the 5 permanent members, put the collective good before their own national interests, insofar as if the countries boycotted the Security Council, it would force reform. We know that, it's a very open secret, but it requires 193 minus 5 countries to say that they will all boycott the Security Council. It requires them to stand up together. Whether that will happen, I don't think so. But if we go back to the purpose of the UN, it's to prevent war and it's to promote human rights. And the fact that a veto can be used to continue war and to allow the violation of human rights is completely anathema to the purpose of this organization.
Yeah, so this just shows the impasse there, which we now have. We have people agreeing. Antonio Guterres, I'm sure himself, wants to stop the war in Syria, wants to stop the humanitarian crisis, has worked hard to help the refugee situation. But there are fundamental issues in the structure of this organisation, the UN, which mean that for many reasons his hands will be tied. Rosa Friedman, you want to come in on that one?
Yeah, ultimately his hands will be tied. He's come in as a political appointment because he has good diplomatic networks, and as the gentleman from Portugal says, he's very good at dialogue and cooperation. But ultimately his hands will be tied if any of the 5 permanent members do not like the approach that he takes, which is why we have to not think about this as the Secretary General leading and directing the UN, but thinking about this as the member states leading and directing it. If the member states together want to stop that war in Syria, they can force the hands of the 5 permanent members, but they have to do it as one unit. And given the geopolitical situations, given the rifts between so many of these countries, whether that can happen, it's not going to happen through one Secretary General on his own, and it's not going to happen through a few countries trying to do one thing or another. It's got to come from the world uniting and saying we cannot watch children dying, whether in Yemen, whether in Syria. We cannot watch women being raped in Sudan. We cannot see these atrocities and allow ourselves to walk past.
Do you think that's a utopian vision, Dov Zakheim, the world coming together, 188 nations, the rest of the UN apart from the Security Council, coming together and saying, look, we will boycott the UN if you don't provide serious reform?
I don't think that can happen for a very simple reason. Each of the 5 permanent members has other countries that are pretty much in its camp. Do you honestly see, for example, right now, Turkey and Iran voting the same way? Do you see the United States and Russia voting the same way? Do you see China and Britain voting the same way? Clearly, it's just not going to happen. Where the Secretary General could make a difference, and I agree with the Deputy Ambassador that he's not the only person or the central person, but working behind the scenes, having some kind of linkage to both sides, to all sides really in the Syrian conflict, might help mitigate matters. We're going to have a new president of the United States. That's going to be some kind of opening. We now have a new Secretary General of the UN. That's some kind of opening. Maybe he can do something. Again, he's not going to be the sole source of solutions, but he might be able to help. But to get all 190-odd countries to go the same way, I don't think it's ever happened, and I don't think it ever will happen. And it can't happen for the very simple reason that all 190-odd countries don't all have the same national interests, or, put it better, don't perceive to have the same national interests.
Yeah, let me bring in Pedro Muta Suarez. You've been something of our resident optimist tonight on the panel. Given those arguments, I mean, can the world ever really come together and put national interests aside? Do you see any reform possible here that could change the way the UN works? Pedro Muta Suarez, are you still hearing us over there in Lisbon?
Apparently doesn't.
Apparently, we have a sound problem there. That's a shame. But let me come back to you here in the studio.
To what was said about the P5 versus the rest of the world. It's true that the rest of the world could be sometimes frustrated because of the P5. But it's true that today, unfortunately, it's not only the P5 which could be regarded as blocking a peace in Syria. I would be much more cautious about the exact role of Russia in Syria. But you have the regional countries, regional players like Turkey, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and so on. It was referred to Yemen as well. Here, it's more a story of regional players. So you see that I'm not sure that the P5 could be regarded as a king of the world of today. It's not true. The world is very much fragmented. And reason why, by the way, the P5 should be larger, as I said earlier, with countries like India, Japan, Germany, Brazil, and so on. And it's not, don't forget that at the UN Security Council, you have 15 members. It means that it's not only the P5, you have the 10 others elected by the General Assembly, and they can play a very important role as well. And to cast a resolution, you need to have 9 votes. So it's not the P5 only. You can see that.
Yeah, absolutely. Many huge issues there to talk about. And we'll have to wait and see, of course, how Antonio Guterres gets on in the new role as UN Secretary General. He'll only take over if he's approved by the UN General Assembly, and even then not before the beginning of next year. So plenty can happen until then. I'd like to thank all my panel. Unfortunately, we're just out of time on the France 24 debate. Lots more huge issues we could talk about. Thank you very much, Yves Dutrieu, Dov Zakheim in Washington. Thank you to you, sir. Rosa Friedman there at the University of Reading in the UK. Good to have you with us. And we lost the connection, unfortunately, but Pedro Mota Suarez from Lisbon, who knows Antonio Guterres well. Thank you all very much for being with us on the France 24 debate. Do stay tuned here to Live from Paris. Coming up right now, it's Media Watch.
Merci.
Time now for a quick look at the stories that have been making a buzz in the press and online. James Creedon's here in the studio with Media Watch. Hi there, James.
Hi, Catherine.
Now, you've been looking into reactions to the nomination there of Antonio Guterres. What are people making of him?
Well, a range of reactions on social media. First of all, Antonio Guterres himself acknowledging that he's been receiving a lot of well wishes, thanking everybody for that, and providing on his Twitter account his bio, because, of course, people who have a familiarity with the functionings of the UN, with his work on the UN refugee issue, etc., would have a familiarity with him and the work that he has done and the high esteem in which he is held. But many people are discovering the personality of Antonio Guterres, so he is sharing his bio online. Others are sharing TED Talks that he has conducted in the past to provide more insight into how he has dealt with the issue of refugees in the past, which is his special brief. Congratulations also pouring in from Foreign Minister Steinmeier in Germany and others around the world, seeing Guterres as a good choice, and that he can confidently rely on German support. I hope the newly elected Secretary General will be more independent and not influenced by the powerful. So you do also have some words of caution. This one from an Eritrean gentleman who is expressing a couple of reservations, perhaps, about Ban Ki-moon's mandate or time as UN Secretary General. I'm disappointed that the next Secretary General won't be a woman, says this Twitter user, but congratulations nonetheless to Guterres. He was the best man in the race, she says. Elsewhere, a lot of people also talking about the fact that he's spoken Portuguese this afternoon. Obviously, for the Lusophone Portuguese-speaking world, this is something that a lot of people are feting. And many people really just talking about the quality of the man and his experience. Great joy and hope in Guterres as the next Secretary General. The world needs and can draw on his competence, knowledge, negotiation skills, values and courage. So that's quite an endorsement for him. And still another a comment in the same vein, saying this is an example of a victory of merit over politics. Somebody, I suppose, who did really have a lot of experience in the UN machine as opposed to a political appointee. But of course, then lots of comments about all of the challenges that would face the next UN Secretary General, in particular Syria, and a continuing massive refugee crisis with greater displacement of population now than ever, exponential growth in the numbers of people being displaced. So certainly huge challenges, and a lot of comments that I couldn't even show, in fact, because they are very disparaging about the role of the UN, in particular in the failure of diplomacy up to this point in Syria. So certainly huge challenges facing Antonio Guterres.
I think that's the least we can say, isn't
Yes.
it? Thank you very much.
Thanks, Catherine.
James Creedon there with Media Watch. And that, in fact, wraps it up for this hour here on Live from Paris.